Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. It was last winter, and I was living alone in a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It was one of those places where, beyond the backyard, everything turned into trees and undeveloped land. I'd been living there for about a year, and honestly, I'd never had any problems. It was quiet, exactly how I liked it. And even though the house had some age to it, it still felt warm, comfortable, like a cozy home. This happened during a long weekend when it was snowing on and off and it was brutally cold outside, often below zero. So I stayed inside at home all day. That night, after dinner and cleaning up a bit, I watched TV for a while and eventually turned everything off and went to bed around 11. There's something I should mention about my bedroom. For about the last 3 months before this happened, the lock on my bedroom door had been broken. It was one of those push-button locks, and one night I realized it didn't work anymore. The door would still click, and it would open from both sides. But I let it go that whole time because, honestly, it didn't seem important. I lived alone, so I didn't have family or roommates I needed to protect my room from. As long as the main entry doors were locked, the bedroom door shouldn't matter. Besides, the hassle of buying a new lock and replacing it sounded completely unnecessary. With that said, at some point later that same night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding fast for some reason, and even though the house was completely dark and silent, I could faintly make out that my bedroom door was slightly open. It felt like alarms were going off in my head, but at the same time I thought it was possible I just hadn't closed it properly and it had drifted open on its own. Maybe the cold or the wind or the natural movement of the house had made it give a little. I got out of bed and walked to the door without turning on any lights, hoping to close it and go back to sleep. I shut it and double-checked that it was properly set in the frame, that it was latched in place, and then I went back to bed. But as I lay down, I felt like something in me wasn't satisfied, like my instincts knew there was more behind it. I opened my eyes again and again, looking around the room, even though I couldn't see anything but shadows filling every corner. I think I lay there, stubbornly waiting to fall asleep again, for about 30 minutes, until something moved in the house. I heard it, a sound like a soft dragging across the wooden floor, either downstairs on the first floor or in the hallway outside my room. I slowly sat up and tried to listen carefully, but it didn't happen again. I stayed frozen, sitting on the bed, making not the slightest sound for a long time. I was worried that if I got up or moved, I wouldn't hear it again, or I wouldn't be able to figure out where it was coming from or what it actually was. Eventually, I kept listening, but I lay back down. I waited and paid attention for a long time, and I don't even remember when I fell asleep. I didn't realize it until I woke up again, suddenly again, with my heart slamming in my chest just like before. And when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the same thing. My bedroom door was open again, just barely separated from the frame. I lay there staring at the gap in the doorway, watching the darkness on the other side. Obviously, the hallway light was off, so outside my room was an even deeper black. I tried to convince myself it was the house again, or that maybe I hadn't latched it the way I thought. But that explanation didn't make sense anymore, because I remembered perfectly how intentional I'd been the last time I closed it, making sure it was properly set. I started to move, getting ready to get up again and walk to the door. But right as I slid my legs out from under the blankets, something shifted behind the frame, like someone had moved within that darkness between the crack of the door and the hallway. I froze completely. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps moving away, no running, nothing. Just the wind creaking through the house. I didn't know if whoever the hell was on the other side was still there, or if they were staring at me, or what they were going to do. I stayed totally still and silent for a full 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, until suddenly I ran to the door and slammed it shut, throwing my full body weight against it to keep it from being opened. But he didn't try to push it open again. There were maybe 15 seconds of absolute silence, and then I heard soft, muffled footsteps, like dull thuds, moving slowly down the hallway and down the stairs. It sounded like he was heading toward the back door, and then everything went silent again. I called the police immediately, and luckily I can say nothing else happened during the roughly 10 minutes I waited for them to arrive and search the house. The officers took a long report about the entire night and everything I knew, which honestly wasn't much. They searched the place, but they didn't find anything. However, while we were in the kitchen talking about what happened, I looked toward the back door because I was explaining that I'd heard the last footsteps going that way, and I saw him again, his silhouette standing among the trees behind my yard. He moved and disappeared quickly before the officers could look. He was probably standing out there watching us from a distance, staring in through the windows, which is sickeningly disturbing and terrifying. That night I went to sleep at a friend's house, and I stayed there for the next few days too. In the weeks after, I didn't really get any more updates from the police, but the snow melted a bit. And then I found things that were even more unsettling in the woods behind my house. There were faint, poorly defined trails between the trees, like someone had walked the exact same path over and over again. And that trail led straight to the back of my house. Whoever that guy was, he'd been stalking me for a long time. Long enough to naturally wear down a path just by repeating it through the woods. And maybe the scariest part of all was realizing that the way he got into the house was probably through one of the back windows, because I found that it didn't close properly, that it didn't lock correctly, just like my bedroom door. It could be a coincidence, but considering he'd been watching me for a while, it's possible that night wasn't the first time he'd been inside my house, and the broken lock on my bedroom door might not have been random either, or some unrelated detail separate from all of this. Needless to say, I moved and I got far away from there. I just truly hope he didn't follow me. Story 2. I know that right now, as I'm writing this, it's the middle of winter, but this actually happened a few months ago, on Halloween. I wasn't sure if I wanted to tell it, but after thinking about it and going back and forth for a while, I decided to share it just in case it helps someone and keeps them from ending up in the same situation I did. I live in a very old apartment building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't exactly a bad area, but it definitely wasn't a good one either. It was the kind of place where most people who can't afford to live downtown end up, because most of the houses and buildings were built in the early 1900s, so they're cheap. My apartment had been remodeled a couple of times, but you could still clearly tell the building itself was in rough shape. A lot of the people who lived in the other units moved out over the last 2 years, and the apartments were left empty. And I don't think whoever owned the building even tried to rent those spaces again. Maybe they wanted people to leave. I don't know. They just left the units empty, sitting there, abandoned. And over time, honestly, I started to believe I was the only person still living in that building. It felt like every time I went in or out through the hallways, I never heard a single sound or saw anyone. It was like an empty, forgotten building where for some reason I was the only one left. I remember perfectly that about a month before this happened, I put some things in the dryer before leaving the building to go to work. And from all 3 floors of the building, I could hear my dryer rumbling through the walls, filling the silence of the staircase and hallways. That's how quiet and unoccupied everything was. Anyway, I worked on Halloween, and being older and living in an apartment, I didn't have much to celebrate. Obviously, kids don't go trick-or-treating inside apartment buildings. And to be honest, no one else even lived there. So I got home, dropped my work stuff on the floor, and sat down on the couch, thinking about watching a horror movie or putting on some Halloween-themed video on YouTube. It was around 9 p.m. when a sudden knock on the door of my unit almost left me frozen with fear. It was 3 loud knocks, and then total silence. It was extremely clear that someone was at my door. I got up, still shaking and confused. Not only because it was the first thing I'd heard that suggested there was anyone in the building after months, but because that person was knocking on my door specifically. I walked over and opened it just a crack, leaving a small gap. And I was even more confused. It was a little girl. She had a Halloween costume on and she was holding up a bag. I think I stared at her for a full 10 seconds, frozen, trying to understand what the hell was happening. The girl didn't say anything either. She just stood there looking at me from behind her mask. The bag she was holding was empty. There wasn't a single piece of candy inside it. I felt a little bad for not having candy to give her, but my mind was focused on something else. Where did this little girl come from? I asked her basically, "How did you get in here? Do your parents live in this building?" She didn't answer. She didn't even seem affected by the question. Honestly, she showed no emotion. I tilted my head toward the hallway and looked past her. There was no one there, no parents, no other kids. The entire building was dead silent. I was about to ask another question when suddenly she turned around and walked down the hallway toward the stairs and left. I stood in the doorway for a minute, listening to her go down the stairs and apparently exit the building. She didn't knock on any other doors. She didn't stop in front of any other unit. There was something way too strange about that. I closed the door and locked it, but I felt like I needed answers. After months of not hearing or seeing a single person, with no signs that anyone else was living there. Suddenly one night, a little girl showed up knocking on my door. It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. I spent a few minutes trying to look out the windows toward the parking lot in front of the building, but my car was the only one there, like always. There was no one outside. Everything was dark, empty, like an abandoned place. After thinking about it for a few more minutes, I put on my jacket and decided to go out and look around. I stepped into the hallway, paused for a moment to listen, and then walked toward the staircase. As I went down, the building felt just as dead as always. There were no signs of anyone on any of the other floors. When I reached the bottom, I looked outside through the front door. The girl was gone. There was no one near the building. Absolutely no one. I know it was Halloween, but this genuinely had me on edge, with a horrible feeling in my body. And right as I was closing the front door, I noticed something else. The keypad next to the entrance had a little light blinking. That keypad was one of those old ones with buttons and a buzzer, and I guess it used to work. But since I'd lived there, it didn't do anything. I always used my physical key, and even if you pressed the buttons, the keypad never lit up or showed any sign of functioning. I assumed it was completely disconnected. So seeing that light on, blinking out of nowhere, was pretty strange. I closed the door and tested it to make sure it was secured, thinking maybe that light meant the door wasn't closing properly. But it latched like always. Still, I started heading back up toward my unit. I didn't like the idea of being outside my apartment with weird things happening that night. I went up past the first floor, then the second. But I stopped dead when I passed through the hallway. I backed up and looked more carefully, confirming what I'd seen out of the corner of my eye. One of the unit doors was open. That had happened in the few minutes between when I went down and when I came back up. I said out loud, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the hallway, and there was no answer, not a sound. I felt a chill run through my body. I hurried up to my apartment, got inside quickly, and shut the door behind me. I felt like my whole body flipped into panic mode for a second. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the living room when suddenly a heavy knock shook the door behind me. Not even 10 seconds had passed since I'd come in. I said, "Hello?" again while staring at the door. Again while staring at the door. The person knocked again, but didn't say anything. I carefully walked to the other side of the door and looked through the peephole. I saw a man. He was dressed completely in black and had a hood covering his face. He knocked again and then pressed up against the door, like he was leaning his body into it. Like he wanted that second I turned the handle, the door would fly open and he'd get inside. I took a few steps back and suddenly I heard something else. Footsteps in the hallway outside. It wasn't just one person. There was more than one. Then I started hearing whispers, but they were only low murmurs filtering through the thin walls. I felt clearly that this wasn't over, that whatever was happening was going to get worse. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, and then I tried to find somewhere to hide, but it was a small one-bedroom apartment, so my options were terrible. I decided to go out onto the balcony, which had blinds covering it, and less than a minute later, I heard a small knock inside the building. Then I saw light slowly starting to spill in, and I heard the door creak as it opened. I watched through the tiny gaps between the blinds. 2 men came in and started looking around. My heart was completely out of control, pounding like crazy. They stayed inside for a while. They even came extremely close to the balcony blinds, but in the end they left. I stayed out there in the cold, waiting 10 minutes until the police arrived. There was no one else inside the building, and during the investigation I learned something that made my blood run cold. I really was the only person still living in that building, at least legally. No one else should have had access except the owner, but I didn't get many answers about what was actually going on. The feeling I was left with was that those men used the little girl to prime me, to condition me to open the door, like they wanted me when they knocked to not think twice and just open it. I moved out in the following days, and it seemed like after I left, everything went quiet. Everything died, like the whole thing faded away. The police stopped giving me updates, and the entire situation ended up disappearing into nothing. I don't know what those men wanted from me, or what was really happening in that building, and I'm grateful I didn't have to find out that night. Story 3. I used to work the night shift at a small shipping warehouse just outside of town. It wasn't a big place. It was a long concrete building with 3 loading docks, a tiny office, and endless rows of metal shelving. Most nights it was just me and 1 or 2 other guys, but the company cut hours during the slow season, so for a few weeks I was completely alone from midnight until 6 a.m. At first I didn't think much of it. I guess the peace and quiet had its nice side, and the job was easy enough. I kept my earbuds in for most of the night, trying not to think about how quiet everything was. The heavy machines that ran all day went completely silent at night, so even the smallest noise would carry an echo. That night in particular was unbelievably quiet. I couldn't hear cars on the highway outside, not even wind hitting the building. From inside, I could hear the soft sound of crickets in the woods right next to the warehouse because there was nothing to drown it out. At some point early in the shift, I put my earbuds in and worked for a long time without stopping. I was in the far back corner scanning a pallet when I heard something that made me stop. Footsteps. Light footsteps. Not rushed or heavy, but almost definitely footsteps. They were coming from the front of the warehouse near the office. At first I thought my boss might have shown up without texting me, which had happened before and scared the hell out of me, as you can imagine. I took my earbuds out and listened again, but now there was nothing. After a minute I convinced myself I'd imagined it, but just as I was getting back to work I heard them again. Just a few slow, spaced-out steps, like whoever it was wasn't sure where they were going. "John, is that you?" I shouted my boss's name, but he didn't answer, and the footsteps seemed to stop too. I walked toward the front, trying to act like I wasn't nervous. The warehouse lighting didn't reach the office area very well, so that part of the building was dim and full of shadows. I turned on the office light and checked inside. I even went into the break area and didn't find anything. I didn't know what else to do besides shake off the feeling and go back to work. Normally I didn't get worked up over things like that, which is why I knew either I was off that night, or something was genuinely off in the warehouse. Another hour passed. I'd finished scanning what I needed and went back to the office to log everything and check a couple things. Like I said before, the office was sort of tucked into a back corner of the building. I sat down and started doing that boring computer work, clicking here and there, reviewing things, and adjusting numbers based on the scans. I hadn't been there more than 5 minutes when, for some reason, I looked up at the hallway window, the one that faced the warehouse floor. Someone was walking between the rows of shelving. It was only a silhouette, barely visible, but even with that quick half-glance, the movement clearly looked like a person walking. I jumped up so fast I knocked my chair over and I shouted, "Hey," to try to stop whoever it was. My voice echoed through the entire warehouse, but after that figure disappeared out of my view behind a shelf, I didn't see anything again. I grabbed the first thing I could find nearby to defend myself, an old metal tool that was on the desk. I left the office and started moving forward slowly, repeating things over and over like, "Who's there? And you can't be in here." No matter how hard I tried to sound firm, my voice didn't sound confident at all. I went aisle by aisle, checking corners, even looking behind boxes where an adult couldn't possibly hide. And still I didn't find anyone. Eventually I reached the back wall, and every row behind me was empty. I stood there staring at the warehouse with a blank expression, trying to understand what was happening. The only places I hadn't checked were a couple of side corridors. I figured if it really was a person I saw, they could have slipped into one of those. But I felt like I would have heard the heavy metal doors opening and closing. Still, there was no way I could go back to work without checking. I opened one of those doors and looked inside. It was an area I almost never went into. I think it led to manager offices and things like that. Places where I had no reason to be. I didn't see anyone, so I turned around and let the door start closing behind me. And right at that moment, I heard the sound of another door opening farther down the corridor. I spun around immediately and grabbed the door before it shut completely. I looked back down the hallway, and now there was a man standing at the far end of it. He looked like he was in his early 20s, but not in the normal way a young guy looks. He looked disheveled, out of it. His eyes were so wide that I could make them out from the other end of the hallway. I don't know if he was high or what, but the way he stared at me was terrifying and disturbing. I yelled at him, asking what he was doing there and telling him he needed to leave. The guy didn't even seem to understand what I was saying. I yelled again, trying to sound more aggressive, and I said I'd already called security, which was a lie, but I hoped it would work. He took a few steps toward me. I couldn't tell if he was complying or just closing the distance, so I stayed in the doorway trying to keep talking to him. I think it was when he was about 15 or 20 feet away from me, around 4 to 6 meters more or less, that I noticed something in his hand. And when I looked back up into his eyes, he lifted his arm and threw it at me. He threw it with all his strength. It flew straight at my head and missed by only a couple inches, slamming into the doorframe next to me. It was a hammer, or some kind of large metal wrench. The brutal echo of metal hitting the frame was so loud it felt like it blew out my ears. In that instant, I turned and ran, hearing the guy chasing me like his life depended on it. I looked over my shoulder a couple of times and saw him still there, only 10 or 15 feet behind me, with that horrible look in his eyes. I made it to the office and locked myself inside, shutting the door as I heard him slam his body into the metal door and try to force it open. Luckily, that office was solid. It only had that metal door in the window, and the window was heavy-duty. Super thick glass, like 4 inches. The kind used in industrial workplaces and not meant to break easily. The guy moved to the window and started attacking it in a rage, ramming it with his shoulder and punching it. He looked completely out of control, like he was insane. But eventually he realized he couldn't get in, turned around and walked away, moving slowly toward the far end of the building and I assume leaving through the back door. By that point I was already using the office phone to contact the police, but they took forever to get to the warehouse, so the guy could have been anywhere by then. And that warehouse wasn't new or modern either. The cameras were terrible. What they did show was the man forcing one of the doors to get in and walking around the place, basically stalking me for almost my entire shift. But you never got a clear view of his face that could identify him. There was also no way to know why he came in or why he tried to attack me. I stayed at that job for a while after that. And the whole event was so absurd that after a few days it almost started to feel like it hadn't been real. But eventually I quit and got a similar job somewhere else, because I figured it wasn't worth staying with the possibility that the guy might come back looking for me.